Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Oh, woke up this morning with
There is a special kinship between the state of Alabama and the state of Mississippi. In this episode of the Stayed on Freedom podcast, we return to the state of Mississippi, continuing our conversation with Dr. Roy DeBerry. Thank God for Mississippi.
I think the thing that changed Mississippi to me, and I remember that so vividly because I was at Cedar Grove School when I got the news from my first grade history teacher, Mr. Boyd, was the assassination, the lynching of Emmett Till. Clearly, black people had been lynched all over Mississippi. We know that history.
Right.
But I think the thing that's made Mississippi different then as opposed to before was the fact this boy was 14 years old. Most of the previous people that had been lynched, both male and female, had been at least 17 or 18. So the fact that they did that, not only did they do that, but the fact that they tried to cover it up. And then when they had a trial, which was nothing but a monkey trial, right? There was no attempt on the part of the jury there in that Delta to bring any semblance of justice, even though his uncle Moses and people like that, his mother, were just had tremendous courage. And one of the things she did, which I always admire, and I remember seeing that in Jet. I remember seeing that Jet magazine, Ebony magazine, when she had that picture of him in that
open casket.
Open casket, right?
Yes, sir.
And a lot of people probably want to disagree with that, but she wanted the world to see
it.
what they had done to her son, a child. I think that was, to me, a pivotal point where Mississippi separated itself and became very different from any other southern state. So growing up, I mentioned the fact about us being insulated, but we were fully aware of what was around us. We were fully aware of where we could go and what we could not do, right? There's always an old state about, there's old saying that says in the South, they don't care how close you get, and in the North, they don't care, basically, as long as you don't get too high. And in the North, it's about, they don't care how high you get, as long as you don't get too close. I say that because when I grew up in Hollis Springs, we talked about the environment was such that white people and black people live right next to each other. There was a white street where white people live, there was a street where black people live. And I felt no fear walking anywhere in Hollis Springs when I was growing up, even in the segregated era. When I got to Boston for the first time, and I was really afraid of going into South Boston. I was afraid of going into East Boston, right? So I'm saying, okay, this is the North, right? The North is supposed to be the promised land, and in the South, I could go places and do things. Again, it wasn't about the movement thing; it was about the control.
Right.
The Southerners were much more about controlling your where you could get in life, whether you could vote, whether you could own stuff. They really didn't care so much about the social movement of black and white people.
Right.
So growing up in Hollis Springs, very much aware of the segregation, very much aware of Jim Crow, very much aware of the school system being segregated, but also, how can I say it? Now as I reflect back on that period and reflect back on those teachers I had, although many of them didn't get the education that they should have gotten, what they got, they imparted to us was values, courage, believing in yourself, thinking you can do things, notwithstanding the environment. We got that. Right? And I think that helped propel me into things related to the movement as a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old, working with SNCC. I think there were people that helped us do that. And of course, we canvassed, as a youngster, which means that some cases we actually went around and knocked on the doors of teachers to ask them to register to vote. And of course, most of them said no, and some of them, closed the door in our face because they realized how dangerous that was for them, lose a job, get beat up, and possibly even killed. I didn't know that at the time, but as I reflect back, I was at Cedar Grove and was 55, so I was 8 years old.
Right.
And
like so, and you
8, 7,
learned about the murder and the mutilation of this 14-year-old boy who had come down from Chicago. And that had an impact on you in a very real way. It also, I think, brought the attention of the country and in the world looking at Mississippi in a particular sort of way. But it also marked a time, it sounds as if, that as you got just a little bit older, I mean, by the time you got to 14, you was talking about integrating the movie theater
and canvassing there in the streets.
and canvassing the streets. So tell me how you made that transition from learning about Emmett Till and having that profound impact on you at Cedar Grove when you were 8 years old to as you got just a little bit older and moved into your teenage years and you began to be connected with, as you talked about before, local sort of role models and how those things kind of drew you into a movement for social justice and change.
Yeah. I guess some of it comes from my parents and some of it comes from my grandparents. This notion that you're worthy. You know, my father used to always say, you know, when even in a segregated period, that he puts his pants on the same way that the white boy puts his pants on, right? So they always taught us that we were worthy, that we weren't better than anybody else, but we were as good as anybody else.
Amen.
And that was taught to us very early on by our parents and by our grandparents. So this notion with Emmett Till, as I said earlier, and hearing about it from Mr. Boyd and later seeing the magazine, because at the time it was prohibited.
Jet magazine, right.
Yeah, it was prohibited for black folk to read Ebony magazine or to read Jet. So what happened to happen?
It was prohibited.
Yeah, because you couldn't get it anywhere. You couldn't buy it anywhere. So the Pullman porters that used to come, there used to be a train from Chicago that came to Memphis, that came through Holly Springs, that went on to New Orleans.
They brought the magazines.
They brought
with
the
them.
magazine with them. And so Mr. Wilkins, Major Wilkins, who had a house that was fairly close to the railroad track, and also not too far from our house, because we used to pass his house on the way from the school going back to our house, he was able to get a copy of Ebony magazine. And so the first picture that I saw of the mutilation of Emmett Till was in that magazine, shared with us by Mr. Major Wilkins, and that was in 1955.
Oh, Lord.
So that was the impact. And the impact then was the fear that we are not that, we're not that much younger than Emmett, right? And so if that can happen to Emmett, that can happen to any of us, right? So you have that. But was the fear paralyzing? No.
Obviously not.
No. And was the fear something that our parents said, you don't do this? My parents, when I started to engage in canvassing, working with the early SNCC workers, even as a youngster, now some of the people in the school didn't particularly like what I was doing, because some of the school teachers, some of the principals were, kind of status quo. They had their job, they had their home, and they had something to lose. Because I learned earlier, if you got something to lose, you tend to be a little bit more fearful. People that don't have anything to lose tend not to be so fearful, because you don't have anything to lose. I'm talking about material things.
Right.
So I think part of that too, my parents didn't have a lot to lose. So they didn't do a lot to discourage us, at least me and my brother, from participating. As long as we stayed in school, as long as we did our homework, and I always felt, based on what my father had taught us, it's very important to do your schoolwork. It's very important to excel. It's very important to read. It's very important to try to write. It's very important to think. And so we were, that was drilled in us.
As long as you were doing that, when these so-called radicals from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, came into Mississippi, they weren't doubling down on discouraging you from getting involved in that.
Not at all, because they opened a COFO house.
Tell us about COFO.
Yeah, COFO, Council of
Federated Organizations.
They had offices all over the state. They opened one in Holly Springs, right? And so, and you had these professors, you had these intellectuals from all over the country. They bought their books. They had the big library there in the room. And so we would leave school in the afternoon, and what we would head to Freedom House. We would head to COFO House.
Wow.
And while we were there, we had a chance to read novels and, essays and found about Richard Wright and Jane Baldwin, because a lot of these things, like you do it now with critical race theory, folk couldn't teach because it wasn't allowed. The curriculum was given to these black schools. Certain books was given to these schools, and most of the history books we had, like a history book, I remember it well, a guy named Bettersworth, and the book talked about happy slaves. You know, that when African people came to America, that, you know, Christian, they became Christian, and so your Europeans did them a favor.
Right.
That's what's in the books. But when we read these other books, we were able to see a different narrative.
And we need to pause on that. So, in the face of a racist curriculum that were being taught in many of these schools,
Right.
in the face of prohibition of certain materials and images being able to even come into or be sold in the community, you had ordinary working class people like the Pullman Porters,
Right.
who brought in materials
Right.
from on the trains.
Correct.
But then you also had community-based organizations, national organizations, civil rights organizations that came in and they said, well, you know what we'll do is we'll set up our own schools, our own Freedom House, and we will make the information available. We will provide an alternative curriculum to what it is being offered, because knowledge is power and we want to make sure that our people are educated. Why don't we do that today?
I don't know, but you know, that freedom school concept grew out of what you just stated, right? And so that in Charlie Cobb's, who was the brainchild behind the freedom school concept, which is still with us today, the notion of intellectual gaps, the notion of also preparing you to be to do what we did in terms of consciousness raising, learn how to encourage people to get registered to vote. And it was also a chance for Black kids to get together and share ideas and talk about resources that they had not been exposed to. So that freedom school concept. I think there are a lot of things that people take for granted. They assume that the school will necessarily teach what needs to be taught, which is not true.
Well, that is a look at Florida and know that that's not true.
Right, right.
And Florida is not an aberration.
Absolutely, not at all. But then, so what had the community took responsibility, the church took responsibility, and the family took responsibility. They say, even though there may be these gaps in terms of this organized, racist curriculum, we are going to find an alternative to address that. So as long as my parents knew I was doing these positive things, and at the same time doing some things that was bringing about some change, they stayed supportive.
So the education was mixed in with the voter registration training, was mixed in with how to organize in a community.
All correlated.
And all of that intersected and came together.
All correlated.
And so tell us a little more about these freedom schools. You talked about Brother Cobb's and you talked about that concept. For those who've never heard of this concept, which continues to be with us today, was this a building? Was there? It was after your regular school hours. How many young people were in it? How young were they? How old were they? What did your freedom school experience?
Well,
look like?
as an analogy, we have something called charter school now. I don't think that was the same concept. I think the concept, in some cases, with respect to the freedom school, in the case of my case, we had the Kofo house where we could go. But then Benton County, which is about 15 miles away, they actually set up a freedom school in a church, Mount Zion Church or Samuel Chapel Church. They were set up at a church. And so, because in some places, the school was problematic anyway. In some rural areas, they didn't even have schools, period. And so for some communities, it was the first time that they had some semblance of organized schools. Others had like Old Salem in Benton County, or I mentioned, our school in Holly Springs, where you did have physical buildings.
Right.
So in some cases you had the Freedom House, in other cases you had the church, or in some cases people met in folks' home. And you talk about ages, I counted initially when I was like maybe 9th or 10th grade, but by the time we reached 64, 65, as I'm getting ready to graduate from high school, we started a class that was started based on the freedom school concept in a person's home. And it was taught by one person named Aviva Futorian. She was like a mentor to me. Another guy was named Frank. I can't remember his last name. But we would actually go out to Miss Evans and Mr. Evans' house, which is 15 miles away. And these were some of us who were anticipating going on to college. And therefore wanted to have something extra, wanted to get that extra push, that extra tutoring, that extra mentoring.
Right.
And so therefore once we went through this, all of us went on to college, right? That was in early 64, late 64, 65. So it took different iterations in terms of how they implemented. But the concept of Freedom School came from Charles, and it was implemented all over the state and all now all over the country, right? That's why you have to end up paying any rent, and oftentimes the local people provided food for them. Oftentimes they had their own garden, so they had fresh fruit and vegetables. In other cases, people sent out clothing if people needed clothing. In some cases, they sent money and other resources. So yeah, there was a coalition of people working to make this stuff happen.
Amen.
And there were people opposed to this notion. You know, people did all kinds of stuff to support people because this was really
Legacy of Harry Belafonte.
yeah, and Sidney Poitier.
Sidney Poitier.
So it's a situation where collectively people work together to make things happen, right? Both locally and nationally and internationally. And there are always decent people, white, black, young and old, the ministry, who work to make things happen and said, look, we're just not going to let status quo be a barrier. We're going to overcome it.
I want you to just talk about what it was like in Mississippi being a young black boy, young black man. I don't call black men boys. As a young black man, 13, 14, 15 years old, moving towards this period of what they called Freedom Summer 1964. Can you tell us a little bit about what was it like to be young, gifted, black, and in Mississippi?
Well, thank you for that. I don't know how gifted I was, but I certainly was young and black. But I think, again, moving forward, I was very active in high school, too, at my regular school, which meant that I was, I think my junior and senior year, I was president of both classes. So the environment was support from the schools, support from family, living in a segregated environment, having other kind of opportunities now present itself as we get into the movement into high school, because high school is very different, obviously, from elementary school. One of the things I noticed until later, because I read up on it, I didn't know at the time that the Sovereignty Commission, which was a Mississippi spy agency, that was spying on students when they would come in. As soon as they crossed the Tennessee border into Mississippi, and you had these spy folk that would passing on information. That's how those workers ended up.
Sovereignty Agency.
Sovereignty Agency was set up by the state, and at the time, J.P. Coleman was the governor. He later became a United States Supreme, not United States, but United States District Judge, right? And he was considered to be a moderate judge, elected in 1960. And as governor, and then served to 64 when Ross Barnett took over. So that was the kind of the climate.
So wait a minute. So you had this sovereignty agency, a Mississippi-based counterintelligence program.
Yeah, and
that was spying.
That was spying on students.
Students.
And all the thing we were doing basically was just, taking part with regular student activities. Although we had some issues with some of the administrators, and may have engaged in some demonstration, but clearly us demonstrating that at the square, and I mentioned Mr. Nero coming, kind of being a safety valve for us, picketing there on the street. Yes, even I found out later, because I found my name in the Sovereignty Commission report, and it mentioned that I had been chairman of the high school organization, president of the high school organization. So yeah, these guys were not missing, and they also had, by the way, people who were giving them information too,
right?
Both black and white.
So
yeah,
again, I got to dig in on that a little bit.
Now we didn't know at the time that we'd been spied on.
Right.
It came later.
And that's like for people who aren't familiar with the COINTEL program,
right?
The counterintelligence program that was exposed of the J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI that had a purpose of disrupting, discrediting, and destroying black freedom movements to, quote, prevent the rise of a black messiah, that targeted Dr. King, that targeted leaders in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee like Kwame Ture, then known as Stokely Carmichael, and a number of others. But that was a national program that not enough people know about, but some people do. I think very few probably are aware of not only the fact that there was a Mississippi-based sovereignty agency, but that particularly it was focusing on students and it was focusing on young people because we do not imagine what they already know. That if they can stop it when a young Martin Luther King is still a teenager. If they can stop it when a Roy DeBerry is 14, 15, 16, if they can prevent the rise of a black leader, the rise of someone who is young, gifted, and black and can have influence enough to be the president of his class in the junior and senior year, if we can stop it early, this is low intensity conflict. This is the way you do. You don't wait until Roy DeBerry has a PhD and he can reach out and he can touch and he can move all over the world and he can make dramatic changes because he has credentials and additional training. Get them early. And I'm thinking about this, brother, because I'm thinking about a podcast interview that we did in February with a young 16-year-old brother in Montgomery, Alabama. His name is Aaron Rudolph. And Aaron came to be known to the world as so-called Black Aquaman. He's the young man at the riverfront brawl on August the 5th, 2023, who jumped off the riverboat, swam across the river, and got up on the dock to defend his co-worker who was being attacked by a mob of white racists. He's 16 years old. And when we met with him, we tried to help him to understand how important he was. That even if he didn't see what his potential could be, that he should know that especially now there were probably many eyes that were looking at him and would be trying to impact and shape him. When you think about a 16-year-old like Aaron Black Aquaman Rudolph today, what type of wisdom, advice, counsel could you share with him? But I'll also say to also share with his parents, who are very important to him and have played an important role in helping to shape and develop him in terms of who he is, in terms of how he can navigate and survive what it is that he may continue to face in 2024. I mean, this is something you were experiencing in 1964, but this is something that he may have to confront in 2024.
Well, one of the things I try not to do is give advice to the next generation. However, I think there are examples. And one of the things that I know for a fact that I was taught to speak up and speak out. Not all the time, but if you saw something that you thought was wrong, you speak out. If we saw something in school that we didn't like, we would speak out. Sometimes you have to be willing to take the consequences for that. And so I think it's important, and that's sort of driven by your own DNA to some extent, whether you believe that, I think people have an internal clock. I think we know when things are not just. I think we know when things are not right. I think we know when we are being oppressed. I think people learn to try to how to make that numb because they don't want to deal with the consequences if they take action against that. And I think the people that try to oppress you they know too when you are about to resist that, even when you do it nonviolently. So I don't think there was ever any question in my mind, even as a youngster, when we encountered certain things that we thought was wrong, that either individually or collectively, we had to speak out about it, say something about it, do something about it, rather than just accept it as being status quo. Now, that is not to say that I think people had created an environment for us where that was possible. I do think there were certain periods, particularly during slavery and right after slavery, when Black people were so oppressed and so repressed and with so much violence that oftentimes they tended not to take action. But even then, we always found people who found time to rebel against something that was wrong, against something that's unjust. So a lot of it, I think, is in your DNA, but a lot of it, I think, comes from your parents, your environment, and then what's possible in that environment as well. And also being able to think, too, because it seems to me one of the things that my parents, father taught me very early in life, mother did as well, that you can think for yourself, that nobody has to think for you, that, you can read, you can learn to read, and you can learn to think, and you can learn to do analysis of a situation. Because I remember in high school when the freedom workers would ask me about who was a power broker in Holly Springs, I could tell them. How was Holly Springs divided up in terms of class? I could tell them. So I could tell them this because I had spent time learning about that system that we operated in, even as a youngster. So I guess it's important to understand your environment, see where you are, and see how you can work with people collectively to change that. And being in high school or being young, so I would again say to a young person, kind of find your own level, what you think is right, what you think is wrong, and act on it with the help of others, allies, if you can find allies.
That's right. Thank you, Dr. Roy DeBerry, and thank you for joining us in this episode of Stayed on Freedom.